So I've always loved to learn. Like my entire life, I've loved learning. But usually I did it through like videos, like YouTube, podcasts, articles, random stuff online. I used the internet to learn all my stuff. And only about the past maybe 3 years, I started actually reading books. And I found them to be, in my opinion, quickly my favorite way to be learning and the most effective way to be learning. Because essentially a book is like a scholar, a really like strong guy in his field. He's basically condensed like 40 years of his experience and his research down into one 6-hour like dense book. And when you spend your time to tackle with a book, you really learn all his lessons. He's condensed it down nicely and you really learn everything. And I haven't always like been reading a lot. Recently, in the past couple months, I've been reading, at least like an hour a day. I read about maybe a book a week on average. I'll tell you in a bit why I don't like to, measure how much I read or whatever. But there have been periods of my life, like earlier this year, where I was doing basically zero reading. And I can very easily correlate those times in my life when I wasn't reading to periods where my skills in my life weren't really improving. I wasn't really improving in my life. So I've kind of gone up and down in these periods of when I was reading a lot and when I was almost not reading at all. So in this video, I want to share with you like some mindsets, some approaches to reading that can instantly make you read way more and can help you enjoy reading a lot more. Reading's so great because when you read, you can literally feel your brain like light up with ideas that you can use to implement into your life. Literally, like when you read a book and you find something that you can literally use to change your life and improve your life, and you see your life slowly change because you implement these skills, bro, it's the best feeling in the world. Okay, so the first thing you need to understand when it comes to reading is you have to follow your genuine curiosities. You have to read what you're genuinely interested in. So there's this quote I really like by the entrepreneur Naval Ravikant. Basically, he says, read what you love until you love to read. Now here's the problem. When people approach reading, they will look online for a book that maybe their favorite YouTuber recommends or something. Like they'll hear that they have to read, how to win friends and influence people, whatever. And they'll pick up the book and they'll start to read it. And because they're not genuinely curious about the book, because they're not genuinely interested in it, they get bored and they don't read it. They stop reading after a while. And this is the thing, you've got to be honest with yourself. What are you genuinely curious about? What do you want to improve and change in your life? Because if you're not actually interested in this topic, in, winning friends and influencing people, then you're going to find this book very boring and you're going to struggle to read it. So don't read something just because you think you need to be interested in it. Don't read something just because other people say it's good. What are you genuinely interested in? For example, there's this book that I know is very, very popular called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And I know a lot of people praise that book and say it's very good, but I tried to read it like a year ago. And honestly, I found it very boring and I struggled to read it. So maybe I wasn't in the right place in my life at the time. Maybe I didn't actually find, the problems were actually helping me much. So I'll come back to that book sometime in the future, but you gotta ask yourself, what are you genuinely trying to improve in your life, and read books based on that. Let's say, for example, you're trying to build a habit in your life. You're trying to build, an exercise habit. Then read, Atomic Habits, a book where you can actually improve habits in your life. Because if the book is actually relevant to something in your life and something you're genuinely curious about, it's gonna be much more enjoyable to read it. So if you love learning about, evolution or something, read about that. It doesn't have to be something practical in your life, but read about evolution till you start to love to read. And then you can read things that improve your life, how to build habits, how to focus better, how to build discipline, all these skills that will actually improve your life. I'm not saying there's something bad about reading about evolution. Actually, I'm reading a book right now about evolution, very interesting. It's about like ecological evolution or whatever. So follow your curiosities. It doesn't necessarily have to be practical. You can learn about maths, physics, whatever you want, but follow your own curiosities. This is the big one. You've got your whole life to read. Why do you have to rush into reading the stuff that everyone recommends? Maybe the stuff that everyone recommends, maybe you'll get interested in it in the future. Maybe maybe right now you don't care about sleep, but in 1 year in the future, you'll realize the importance of sleep, and suddenly you'll be obsessed about sleep and you'll want to read a book like Why We Sleep by Matt Walker. So wait until the curiosity arises inside you and read about it. For example, I didn't care about leadership like a year ago, but since I've been like improving my speaking skills, improving my camera presence and everything, I've reached the point where now I'm genuinely interested in leadership and genuinely interested in motivating people, hyping people to take action. So that's something I've been very interested in learning about recently, about leadership. Okay, so kind of related to following your genuine curiosities, here is why people read completely the wrong way. So people will have a book that they're reading. For example, let's say, this book. They've got this book that they're reading. And this is the only thing they're reading. When they don't feel like reading, for example, let's say it's nighttime and it's time to read. If they don't feel like reading this book, it means they don't feel like reading at all. And this is the problem. So you ask someone like, what are you reading right now? They'll have like one book, a book that they're reading. I don't know if this makes sense. But what I want to tell you is don't be afraid to have multiple books in your rotation. At any one time on my Kindle, I'll have 10 books that I'm kind of rotating through and reading, and I'll read whatever I'm interested in that moment. If I'm not interested in learning about a certain topic, I won't read about it. I'll read something else. The problem is people will just have one book that they're reading, and until they get to the end of that book, they won't even think about reading anything else. So don't get too attached to one book. Always be jumping around reading multiple books. Now it's kind of hard if you don't have a Kindle. If you're buying physical books, are you gonna go buy 10 books or whatever? Maybe. There are ways around this. I'll get to that later. But don't get attached to one book. And related to this, don't get attached to, so how do most people read? Again, they'll start at page 1, they'll read the foreword, they'll read the intro, they'll make their way to the end of the book. Again, this is a mistake. It's not a story. This book is not a story. There's a mindset I really like from Ali Abdaal. He says read a book like you would read an article. You would read an article by, first of all, skimming through it, getting a general idea of what's going on in the article, and then you would kind of jump around to sections that you're interested in, sections that stand out to you. And if there's a chapter, a section that doesn't interest you, you skip it. Now, I'm not saying skip every single section, because sometimes, a story might be a bit boring in the book, but it might actually be useful to read that story and, push through it. But sometimes there might be entire chapters where you're like, yeah, I don't really need to know this, I can skip this. So don't be afraid to jump around and skim around books. And this is the problem. People love to get attached with how many books they read a year. It's like a way of virtue signaling. They're like, oh bro, I read 50 books last year. I read 20 books last year. And you've got to get over this, because we don't read to calculate how many books we've read a year. So, it's not sexy to say oh yeah, bro, last year I read 30 books in full, 20 books I read 2/4 of them, one book I reread 5 times, because when you read a whole book, it gives you a sense of accomplishment when you go from beginning to end. But you have to get over that. You don't be afraid to jump around the book, read to different sections. Don't be afraid to reread chapters that you want to get a second insight on. Or the best books that really give me a lot of value, for example, this one, I'll reread them very often. This book, I will always revisit chapters and reread them. The best books, don't be afraid to reread them. If you reread a book, often the second time around, you will get a lot more value, because you'll approach the book from a different perspective in your life. You'll see things that you didn't see the first time. So yeah, don't get attached to how many books you're reading, and don't be afraid to jump around. And also don't be afraid to abandon one if you don't find it interesting. For example, often, I'll see the first few chapters, and if I don't enjoy it, if it's not what I thought it would be, then I'll just completely abandon it. I'll move on to something else. That's also fine as well. So it's what we're measuring here is we're not measuring, how many books we read. We're measuring how much our actions, our behaviors change, how much our perspectives of the world change. That's what we're measuring. And that doesn't come with the quantity of books. So also, when you're reading, slow down. Don't try to speed through it and get through it just so you can add it to your, Goodreads list or whatever. Take your time, take it slow. If there's something that, you really need to understand deeply, or it's giving you a lot of value, then don't be afraid to slow down. That's why I don't like these challenges read 10 pages a day or whatever, because that's not what it's about. It's much better to read one page very, very slowly and get a ton of value from it that you can actually implement than it is to read 5 chapters and get nothing out of it. So yeah, I kind of want to elaborate on this. People say, for example, when you read, you should take action, read and take action on every single chapter or whatever. 100%, that's the reason we read or whatever. But I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing if you're not constantly taking action. I remember when I first started reading, I pretty much was not taking action at all. I read 3 books and I took 0 action on them. And especially if you're just getting into reading, I think that's completely fine. I think it's much better to establish that habit of reading, establish that curiosity of reading, and you'll eventually be inspired to take action. I think it's okay to have this period of not actually taking action and just, reading, just to get into the habit to understand why it's a good thing. That doesn't mean never take action or whatever. Eventually, you do want to get to the point where you're reading the book through the lens of wanting to take action. And on top of that, that means, taking notes. You know, you should be taking notes on things that you find interesting, on things that you can actually use. But as a beginner, if you're told that you need to take action when you read, you know, every page you got to take action, you got to take notes or whatever, it can be very overwhelming and it can stop you from building that habit of reading. So I think first of all, the most important thing is just to get into that habit. And you can always come back and reread those books that you first started off reading and didn't take any action on. Like the first time I ever read this book, I took zero action. I just read it, but I found it very interesting, very insightful. Like it was still changing my mind even though I wasn't taking action. And then when I came back to read it again, that's when I started taking action on it and actually using it to, you know, change people's minds, to be a leader or whatever. Like I remember a long time ago when I first started reading, what I was very interested in was talking to girls. And so the book that I read the fastest was Models by Mark Manson. I'm pretty sure I read that in like one sitting. You know, I went to the toilet, I ate or whatever, but like I read that book in one sitting. And I didn't take any action on it while I was reading it. I didn't do any of that, but it got me into the habit of reading a whole book, of, you know, being curious about reading. And I think it was better to do that for 6 hours than to, you know, do random stuff for 6 hours that doesn't benefit you. So, but this is just a point I want to make. That sometimes people go through this period where they're not inspired to take action, they don't know what to do. But that's fine, just build the habit of learning because you've got your whole life to take action. Okay, now I want to go through really quickly like how you should read. You know, should you use a Kindle? Should you use physical books? Should you use PDFs? You know, should you do audiobooks? Well, personally, I do all three. So audiobooks, I use Spotify. Sometimes I use an audiobook, but I much prefer like the physical copies. I prefer to see the words and like actually take notes on it and take my time with it. I find when I use an audiobook, I kind of get lost. So this is all down to personal preference. If you prefer audiobooks, go ahead, use them. There's really no difference to them. You know, if you like reading it on a PDF, go ahead or whatever. Use a Kindle, use a physical book, but I'll go through the advantages of each. The one I use the most is a Kindle because honestly, it's so simple. It's just this small block. You know, you don't have to hold this clunky book. You know, you can lay down and do that like, you know, cursed position when you read. You know, you don't need this physical book kind of being all in your face or whatever. And with a Kindle, you can just have like 100 books on it. You can get free samples on it so you can try books before you actually buy them. The books are slightly cheaper. You know, it's just much simpler to just hold this tiny device and read it. You know, people say they like the feeling of a physical book or whatever, and sometimes I do like that feeling. But once you get used to the feeling of this small tablet, it feels much better in my opinion. I would rather hold this than this. I thought I would hate it at first, but I much prefer it. And it's good because you can have like 50, 100 books on here and you can just rotate between them rather than having to carry a stack around with you. And also if you can find PDF copies online, you can put it onto your Kindle. At least that's what my friend told me or whatever. Yeah, another thing you can do is you can just find a free PDF online and you can read like the first couple chapters and see if you like the book, and then you can go buy it. Or you can get secondhand copies or whatever, do whatever you want. But you can also get like a secondhand Kindle. Like this one I got, I think for $50 or something. It's very, very effective. And the backlight feature is really, really good as well. Like this is pretty much, I don't need sleeping pills at night. What I do is I turn on the light on this thing and I'll read it in bed until I start to get tired. And then when I get tired, I'll turn it off. I'll throw it to the side and I'll fall asleep. So it's a very, very effective way to do that as well. And yeah, the final thing related to that is make it fun. You know, make it an enjoyable experience. Something that you look forward to, something that's, you know, like, you know, set up a nice cozy environment somewhere in your room, you know, make the couch nice, you know, make the room smell nice, whatever, make it a fun experience. You know, I look forward to the end of my day because for the final hour of my day, often, I'll just spend that reading and I'm actually excited for it or whatever. Or, you know, go for a walk into the park and, you know, do it in the sunlight. You know, that's another great thing about it. You're disconnecting from screens, you're disconnecting from technology, and, you know, you're reading or whatever. And this is kind of related, but be a reader. You know, change your identity to be someone who reads. Not all readers, I forgot who said this, not all readers are leaders, but all leaders are readers. So, you know, see yourself as a reader, adopt it as your identity. You are someone who simply reads every single day. You know, and you've got your whole life to cultivate this identity, but I 100% think it's an amazing thing to cultivate the identity and the lifestyle of a lifelong learner. You know, not someone who just gets education from the education system, but someone who learns outside of it. Because, you know, one of the saddest things is once school ends, once university ends, people stop reading, and that's the saddest thing. I mean, people stop learning, and that's the saddest thing. So, you know, cultivate yourself to be a lifelong learner. Cultivate yourself to continuously be learning your whole life. You know, you've got your whole life to adopt that identity. And because I always wonder, like, what are some things that we can confidently say that everyone should do? You know, should we say that everyone should be lifting weights? Maybe, maybe not. You know, maybe if you want to become a professional tennis player, maybe you don't need to lift weights or whatever. You know, maybe there's people who prefer other styles of exercise. Fair enough. You know, can we confidently say that everyone should, you know, journal or whatever? Again, maybe, you know, maybe some people don't need to, whatever. But I think one thing we can confidently say is that everyone should be learning stuff in their life, gaining knowledge. And that's one of the greatest parts of, you know, existence. Because I promise you, you will not regret it in the future if you were learning every single day. You wouldn't look back into your life and say, oh, damn, man, I wish I didn't learn as much. You would never, you know, come to that realization. So let me know what you're going to read next. See you later.